Belt of Truth Live. It's 5:45, and you are with us for a very interesting interview and program. I've been looking forward to this one. It's a topic that is a passion of mine, the topic being religious liberty. Our guest will be Barry Bussey, and you're going to see him shortly. He practices law with Bussey Ainsworth in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, and is the president and CEO of First Freedoms Foundation Canada. He's been involved with charity and religious freedom issues for over 31 years, has argued religious freedom cases at all levels of the Canadian court system, from the tribunals to the Supreme Court of Canada, has studied theology, law, political science, and peace and conflict studies. So I can't wait to bring him up in just a moment. But first, I just want to welcome each and every one of you and thank you for being here. You are what make this broadcast interesting and engaging. And of course, we've got our product right there that so many of you came out and purchased last time. People are loving the immune boosting sampler pack. I just held up just two of them. The Revita Guard, of course, is the throat spray. That one, I was literally just using that this evening before we started and went live. So I felt a little something in the throat. You can, I can tell you from experience how many times people around me are getting sick, and I do the spray up the nose and on the throat. But even when you don't feel something, just carry the hand sanitizer with you. This is the lavender scent, and you just spray that on your giant social media hands, and it's not the sticky alcohol smell and the nastiness of the conventional not super good for you hand sanitizer. So you can get all of those, get a couple of different scents, and you'll be able to get a sampler pack for nearly half off. You see that discount there. So you guys help make all of this possible, and all the editing and all the work that we do with our social media team. So I wanted to share a couple of testimonials from people who've gotten these. My wife, kids, and I use Revita throat and nasal sprays most days. Even with small kids getting into all kinds of things and interacting with other families, we rarely get sick. And of course, this person attributes that to the natural laws of health, a good diet, and our Revita living sprays. And they say thank you. So you can read those as they continue. But that one, by the way, this person says they've had good success with both. I like using them in tandem. That's the nose, the nasal, and the throat, because it sometimes starts in one, goes to the other, and you may not even feel it yet, but there's stuff going around this time of year. It's been a nice fall here in Michigan. Man, the weather's been in the 80s, and so I think fall is starting soon and shortly here, so we're bracing ourselves for that. Let's bring our guest up and have a conversation about religious liberty. And the first thing I want to ask you, Barry Bussey, is you got into this topic in addition to studying theology. You've been into law and freedom and arguing in the courts. And I just want to, how do these two unite? As a Christian, why is this work a passion of yours?
Well, I think it comes from my background. I grew up in the province of Newfoundland, which is the island province, but also has a mainland part, which is known as Labrador. But in the island of Newfoundland, where I grew up, I was very much, even early on in life, involved in politics because my uncle was a member of the Newfoundland legislature. And so when I was really young, 8 years old, I'd be going door to door, handing out flyers, that kind of stuff. And then later on, when my family became Seventh-day Adventists, the community, the experience of that was such that I was very much involved in when you're living in a society where people have been the one faith community for generations, and I mean multiple generations, all the way from England, Wales, where my family came from originally, many hundreds of years ago, to the province. And then suddenly you now change religion. Then there was all kinds of angst and discussion about religion and all that kind of stuff. And also in Newfoundland society itself, it was always a Catholic Protestant divide. So that's where the cleavage was in society for a long time. And so religion was a big thing, and politics was a big thing for me. Then as time went on, I became very enamored with the stories of the Reformation, studying the Reformation, studying religion studied political science, history, and so on. And I just became convinced of the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the inviolability of the person. Those were key items that was part of my study, part of my interest. And along with it, I often toyed with the idea to become a minister, which I did for a season, and then do I go into law, which I did for most of my career. In fact, all of my career, in one way or another, has been tied to the religion, politics, law, and ministry. So I've kind of combined both of those in the work that I do now as a lawyer, but also as an advocate for religious freedom here in Canada.
So you've got a foundation, First Freedom Foundation. What's behind the formation of that? I hear that this is your passion, and kind of what was it that prompted the founding of or the forming of that organization?
During the whole COVID experience, it was important for me, it seemed, to speak out about what was going on with respect to the government enforcing lockdowns, uh, but not only lockdowns with vis-a-vis churches and so on, but the real struggle came during the 2019 general election, 2021 general election, when the prime minister decided that anybody who was not vaccinated would lose their jobs, would be unable to fly, travel in the country on either bus or train or plane. And that was something that I couldn't believe was happening in modern society. I had done a lot of research in the past with respect to conscientious objectors in World War II in Canada, those of the various Mennonite groups, the Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, other religious communities who refused to bear arms, for example, during the time of war. And even with that, while they were nevertheless treated with, how would I say, uh, treated with respect in the sense that they were accommodated. They were accommodated to a point. They still had to serve the same amount of time as those who were conscripted into the military, but they had to do it in work camps around the country. And that was provided for these dissenters, as it were, with respect to what was going on at wartime. And now suddenly we've got another national emergency or perceived national emergency with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the government was taking a very harsh stand on people who conscientiously objected on religious grounds. And so I decided that it was important to do something about it. And so myself and others, we gathered together and started First Freedoms Foundation. And we ended up getting the term First Freedoms from a 1953 Supreme Court of Canada decision that involved the Jehovah's Witnesses in the province of Quebec, wherein Justice Ivan Rand at the Supreme Court of Canada, when he wrote his decision, stated that there are three original freedoms, and they were freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and inviolability of the person. Those then, um, as we were discussing, it was my wife who actually came up and said, well, why don't we just call it First Freedoms Foundation? And so that's how we got to name. Now, subsequently, I learned that there is a First Freedoms Foundation in the United States, but we're um, not associated or part of that organization. And so oftentimes I'll use the moniker First Freedoms Foundation and then put in brackets Canada. So that's kind of how we came about. And then immediately upon us becoming an organized nonprofit, and we are a nonprofit, we're not a charity. So any donations that are given to us do not receive charitable receipts. And that was done by design in the sense that because we wanted to have the freedom to be able to speak our minds on political issues, we decided that we wouldn't want to be a charity because of all the various rules with respect to political discussion and so on amongst charities. Even though now the Canadian government is somewhat, how will I say, which is interesting, allowing a lot more for political commentary from charities. But generally speaking, you're beholden much more to government because you're so reliant upon charitable donations. So we we forego that. We didn't want to do that, and so anyhow. So then we then as we came into existence, all of a sudden we had this issue coming up that the truckers also had to be vaccinated in order to do trucking, and especially when they went down to the States and back and forth. And so then that became a huge issue. The convoy was started in Ottawa, well, started throughout the country in various places. Yes.
Pause,
Yep.
because I haven't read it, but the listeners need to know you got a book, a new book, 2013 public or 23 publication, so it's still new, very fresh on that topic, right? I want you
Right.
to continue your flow of how the trucker thing got you involved in this, but tell us about your book and then return to your train of thought, because
Sure.
Jeremy brought that up. I'm like, boom, there it is.
Yeah, so it's entitled 210 Degrees Celsius, 16 Ways the Truckers Ignited Canada for the Long Haul. And the 210 degrees is the temperature at which diesel self ignites. Unlike, for example, the internal combustion engine in a gasoline engine, where you have to have a spark plug to ignite the gasoline, in a diesel engine, you just have to heat it. You have to heat up the engine block, which is what the glow plugs do. And then the diesel just automatically explodes and then starts the engine. So that's at 210 degrees Celsius. And so the idea was that as the government was putting more and more pressure on the Canadian people, and as things heated up in the political realm during the COVID experience, the people just automatically ignited, as it were, and said enough is enough. And so then they went into this protest, um, not only in Ottawa, but Ottawa is where the focus of the book is on because I was there. I went there over 2 weekends and just observed and watched all what was going on, paying attention to the arguments that were being made back and forth. And then when the government implemented the Emergencies Act, which in essence created a martial law kind of operation in Canada for 9 days, which is like extraordinary. It was kind of like taking a sledgehammer to kill a gnat. It was unheard of. And that then really got me going. And so I wrote the book recognizing that the government so overplayed itself that it actually became cartoonish in its overreaction. And what is interesting, if you would look at the political development in Canada since that experience of the convoy, the Freedom Convoy 2022, the government has steadily lost public support. And my sense is that while, there's other factors that would perhaps be argued by political scientists and observers and so on, but nevertheless, it seems to me that that experience of the invoking of the Emergencies Act really started the momentum for change in Canada, which right now, if an election were held, there would be a very different government in Ottawa than it is now.
You mentioned those first freedoms being speech, religion, and the inviolability of the person. That may be language and terminology, our American audience especially, or we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And you
Right.
threw out speech, religion, and explain that third one to folks. I think it may have something to do with the topic you're discussing with the mandates and the truckers.
Yes. So, in law, throughout the British Commonwealth, in our British common law experience and history, has been the idea that government is to treat the human being as inviolable. In other words, you don't just simply pick a person up off the street and incarcerate them without due process of the law. And so the problem with the whole COVID experience, in my view, was a violation of that inviolability of the person principle in the English common law. You don't force any kind of medical treatment on anybody without their consent. And people say, well, it's up to you to decide if you want to be vaccinated in this particular experience. But I mean, that was the context. But I mean, it applies to other contexts. But the reality is, yes, but they say, okay, well, it's your individual choice. And yet, if you don't follow what we mandate, then you're not going to be employed. You're not going to be able to travel from one end of the country to the other. And in some places, like in the Maritimes, you couldn't go from one province to another. You couldn't drive from one province to another in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI. Like, okay, so you're saying in the one hand, it's your choice, but we're going to take away your freedom of mobility. We're going to be, putting these pressures on you to ensure that you do that. And what really resonated with me was when I studied some years ago, and I interviewed a number of individuals who were conscientious objectors in World War II, and they would share with me stories of how, because they refused to bear arms, they were immediately fired by their employers. um, some of them were rounded up by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, here in Canada, and taken off to the work camps and that kind of stuff. And it was like, my word, this kind of has some resonance here, where people say, okay, well, you have a choice. And then what was also interesting in the World War II experience, a number of the uh, conscientious objectors would tell me that the government would send people to the camps and basically were trying to recruit them, because as the war wore on, they needed more and more recruits. But it was kind of like, okay, have you had enough yet? In other words, have the work camps working up in the woods in Banff and Alberta and British Columbia and Northern Ontario, cutting trees and opening up new roads and those kinds of things by pick and shovel, not by any kind of machinery, but just pick and shovel. Have you had enough yet? Are you ready to join up now? And it's kind of like, okay, if we make life really hard for you, have you had enough yet for you to go against your conscience and do what the government says? So it's that principle of being forced against the conscience that really caused me to say, hey, like this, that there's something seriously wrong here.
So all three of those really orbit around this sacredness of the individual conscience and one's relationship with God. Because your speech for a Christian, that's a religious matter also, right?
Oh,
Your
yeah.
health choices and the inviolability of the person in their physical body in this sense, that's a worship matter. This is the temple of God. We offer
Right.
our bodies as living sacrifices. And I liked how you brought up the piece about how, well, we're not mandating it, but if you don't take it, then this, and this. I heard top religious liberty attorneys in my own church denomination, one in particular, wrote a piece saying, well, it's not a mandate, but it's appropriate for those who refuse to get vaccinated to not have the same freedoms to go to work and travel. And I'm like, that is playing with words in a diabolically manipulative way to
Mm.
pressure people while saying, oh, you still have your freedom. So I appreciate you bringing that out. And then also when you bring out the truckers thing, and folks should look at that book, because I want to see, you were there. What did you see? I mean, we saw what we saw on the news. We saw some brutality towards some of the demonstrators. And I thought, I am kind of ashamed of my country because we've got a history of civil disobedience and nonviolent action to bring attention to injustices. And my wife's Canadian. Canadians are very nice, and usually the Americans are the ones to light the torches and really raise a fuss about something to insist on liberty. But this time it was the Canadian truckers that made the noise to bring attention to this injustice. So I just got to give you guys a pat on the back for that. And it was a nonviolent thing, right? And then they were demonized as being Nazis and stuff. Tell us a little bit more about the truckers, and we'll move on to your
Yeah,
issues.
it was quite surreal. So I went up there on the opening couple of days of the protest itself in Ottawa, and it was a carnival-like atmosphere. It was a time where, remember, up to this point, we've now been living in a almost 2 years of lockdowns. You're not allowed outside. Many people were reporting on their neighbors as to whether or not they left the house when they should have stayed in. Many people had to have groceries delivered to the door. It was there was this sense of cabin fever in the country, and Canada's a big place, and yet here you had neighbors virtually spying on one another, reporting their neighbors to authorities, to health authorities, saying, "Hey, this person has left their house. I don't think it's appropriate." All that kind of stuff, and then having police show up at the door with the health inspectors. I mean, people were just like, just had enough of it. And when they came up to Ottawa, it was kind of like everything opened up. Everybody was just happy to be there. It was kind of like open space, open to be able to talk and fellowship and discuss. And what was interesting was that a couple of things. One was that the press tried to paint the truckers as Nazis. There was one Nazi flag and one Confederate flag. Now, just ask yourself, for example, why would either of those two flags be shown up in Canada? And the Nazi flag was held up by one person, and it was only for a short period of time, and no one really knows who the person was, what happened to them, but they walked up along the Chateau Laurier, which is the big hotel in Ottawa, beautiful hotel, almost looks like a castle, and they walked beside the hotel and then disappeared. But yet what was amazing is that the reporters were able to take a whole bunch of snapshots of that one guy holding the flag, never saw again. Then there was another guy who was totally masked up and totally couldn't see who he was, holding up a Confederate flag. And soon as he unveiled the Confederate flag, the local people around him said, "Hey, what are you doing here with this flag? Get off of this, like leave." And so everyone like recognized, like, are these two plants? That was going on. And yet those were the stories that the mainstream media, CBC News, CTV, Global, all of the Canadian news, who I should say as well, are heavily funded by the Canadian government, which is a whole nother story. But that's what was reported. And then there was, saying that there was all kinds of hate. I never saw any of that. There were young people out on the street playing hockey, road hockey there in front of the Parliament buildings. There were street preachers all over the place. That was another thing I thought was fascinating. There were church choirs that were singing. It was a time. Now, I will also say, though, there were a number of flags that were advocating rather rude comments towards the prime minister. And I remember thinking, my word, like this kind of takes away from the spirit of the thing. And when I came back a week later, there were a lot less of those flags. And from what I hear from some friends of mine who were up there more extended time than I, was that there seemed to be, as time went on, from the first weekend to the second weekend, there was this sense of like everyone was angry, but yet nevertheless peaceful. There were a lot of those very, for me, they were offensive. But as my good friend who's a law professor told me, Barry, we need to allow people to be able to say all kinds of things against our leaders, i.e., in this case in Canada, our prime minister, as long as, of course, they're not advocating violence and all of that kind of stuff. But to be able to just tell them off. And so I say, okay, well, freedom of speech, as long as it's not violent. But for me, it was nevertheless offensive. And I wrote about that in the book to some extent. But also the debate I had with the law professor with respect to this. And so there's some give and take in that. But overall, it was a joyous affair. It was not one bit violent. The street preachers were doing their thing. People were happy to see one another. They were making friends. And what's interesting, a lot of people will tell me that they made friends from across the country. We got in Canada, historically, there was always, this English French divide. Well, let me tell you, we had people from French Canada that literally came across the river from the Ottawa River over to the where the Parliament buildings are in Ontario, the English speaking side, as it were. And yet there was lots of camaraderie because everyone was kind of like we were all in this same boat, and we needed an opportunity to be able to express ourselves and to be able to do so peacefully. And that is an amazing power, and it's still reverberating. And that's why I think, like I say, with the title of the book, is that this experience has ignited Canada, not just on the short term, but I think it's a long-term thing, because it also shows that nonviolence works. Like, it really does work. And when we allow for discussion and being able to, there was one guy who showed up, and I have a picture of him in the book, and he holding up a big sign, and he's saying, vaccines save lives, right? And so, of course, there was all kinds of discussion going on between him and the others who were there. But he was able to come. He didn't have his sign taken off. There was no stomping on his sign. There was no pushing or shoving or anything like that. I mean, there was really engaged discussion, but he was not in any way accosted. And I thought, you know what? That's really good. That's how it should be.
Yeah, we got to defend the speech on all sides, right? The
Absolutely.
only the only speech that needs defending is the offensive speech,
Yeah,
because the speech that offends nobody is not going to be under attack and in danger of being shut down.
exactly.
I like the comments earlier about the crazies with the flags. It gives new meaning to the term false flag
Oh,
operation. I'm not a false flag denier, so I tend to be sympathetic to that interpretation. But let's talk about current things that are going on. What
sure.
is First Freedom Foundation doing now? What kind of things are you tackling in our current environment?
Yeah, well, I tell you, one of the things that's going on right now in Canada is a whole number of things with respect to that's going on in Canada right now. We've got um, there's a huge discussion going on about freedom of speech during during COVID. There was a a whole discussion that opened up about uh, residential school systems. Now, what that was that in the soon as Canada became a country in the early years and continued right on up until the 1960s, if not the early 70s, there were residential school systems sponsored by various churches, uh, mostly the mainline religions like the Anglicans, the Roman Catholics, and so on, United Church. But there were also some residential schools, as I understand it, by smaller groups, such as Mennonites. And so what they would do is they would bring um, the indigenous young people, take them from their various reserves, bring them down to the residential school where they were, in essence, kind of like in an like, I mean, they weren't orphans, but you know what I mean, like an orphanage, so a residential school. And they would be taken away from their families and they would be raised there on government expense, and they would be taught school like the regular um, curriculum that any Canadian student would be expected to receive in the public schools. But these were, of course, run by churches. And you should also know, too, that a lot of Canadian schools were started by churches historically. And so there's always been um, stories, not only stories, but also actual uh, incidences where some of these children were abused. Well, I think it was around 2020 or thereabouts. I guess maybe it was in 2021. Um, in the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, there was uh, a a radar system was going over the property, and they found some anomalies. And they were of the view that that was, in essence, graves of students who had passed away. And yet there were no markers and all that kind of stuff. And that became a huge story. So much so that the prime minister lowered the Canadian flag on our peace tower, which is the high tower on our House of Commons and the Senate building, the Parliament, for over 3 or 4 months, if not longer. It's the longest time ever the Canadian flag has been down at half mast. And so there was this idea that there were, some children's graves. And then some other residential schools or former schools around the country also found these kind of anomalies. However, um, here we are now, these 3 years later, and no graves have been excavated. And the First Nation who made this announcement stopped referring to these anomalies as children. And so now we're got into a big debate. Okay, were there graves or no? Will they allow people to dig it up and to see? Well, no, no one will be allowed to dig it up. But we now must accept that this is a possibility. And so there's a real huge debate going on right now in Canada about whether or not there should be freedom of speech on this issue. And just last week, uh, the NDP member, um, Miss Leah Gazen, she put forward a private member's bill, which is Bill C 413, and basically says that you can face up to a 2-year jail term for, quote, condoning, denying, downplaying, or justifying the Indian residential school system in Canada. Now, while the NDP, which is the Socialist Party in Canada, is currently aligned in keeping the current prime minister in power with his Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party doesn't have a majority of the seats in the House and need the majority in order to rule. And so relying on the NDP for that support is going to be questionable as to whether or not this will ever ultimately be passed. But here we got a bill saying if you deny or you downplay, if you justify the Indian residential school system in Canada, you could face up to 2 years in imprisonment. Now, that is one issue. Then there's the issue of Bill C-63, which is an online harms act, where the government now is basically uh, saying that This act will jail Canadians for life if they're caught promoting genocide. And there's a whole bunch of other things that's involved in that act. For example, that if someone is offended by language used on the online, then that person could be taken to uh, the person who's offended could anonymously go to the authorities, file a complaint, and the government then in goes and does an investigation on the person who caused the offense, and you can face years in jail. You can also face um, having to pay the person who was offended $20,000 plus $50,000 to the government. So these are the kinds of things that's ongoing right now. There's other things that are happening with respect to freedom of speech in Canada. Uh, I don't know if we got time to get into, but those are some of the things we're following.
So, am I hearing from these proposals that there is a human right to not be offended?
You know, it's interesting. I have toyed with the idea of putting together a legal brief about this idea of offense and what does it mean in law and whether or not there is a constitutional right not to be offended. I've kind of teased it in a piece that I got published recently. But yeah, I mean, that seems to be where we're headed. And of course, that creates a whole bunch of issues that I don't think we're going to be able, like, it's kind of like fooling around with sticky tape, you know, a tape where it's sticky on both sides and you're trying to take it off, but you just get more wrapped up into tape. And that is the kind of thing I think we're headed right now with this kind of thinking going on.
That's the perfect analogy. It's that's going to be opening the biggest can of worms, and I guess it's already happened online, but it seems that it's only certain directions, I'm talking politically, ideologically, that receive that protection. It's not a uniformly applied protection against being offended as if we would really want that, but I mean, you know that there are agendas on social media already outside of the governmental sphere, although we've seen those lines have been blurred. But those are interesting cases. And, you know, I remember growing up and I started to get interested in political science toward the end of high school and ended up, you know, studying that in my undergrad and in my graduate studies. And early on in that, encountered the fact that, whoa, it's not the same way in Europe and Canada as it is in America. And they've jailed people for Holocaust denial, which I
Hmm.
think is ridiculous. But the idea that somebody would be criminally prosecuted for a nutty belief about something, does that go into the phrase you used was online harms are those things that promote genocide?
Hmm.
Okay, well, yeah, you can't plan and plot a criminal act or threaten people, but I'm guessing there's a wide definition of what promote genocide means, like Holocaust denial would fall under that.
Yeah, well, I think it purports to be more than just that. It purports to be like, okay, you know, you're really out there, you're advocating for the removal of a particular group of people and that kind of thing. But the problem is we don't know ultimately how that all is going to be interpreted. One of the things is the idea and concept of hatred. So, what does hatred mean? Well, hatred, according to the Supreme Court of Canada, is the idea that you so vilify and you detest another individual in a very extreme manner, or words to that effect. Well, okay, so if I'm a member of a group and I feel I am so threatened, um, I can now use the apparatus of government. Like the government is planning on a whole new bureaucratic regime. It's going to be um, like over $200 million to get this thing off the ground. And there's going to be a special commission on online digital harm commission. There's going to be an online digital ombudsman. There's going to be other agencies that are going to be working with uh, government apparatuses, so that anybody who makes these complaints is going to have the whole apparatus of the state to go ahead and pursue somebody who they feel is involved in hate. Well, just think about that for a minute. We've already seen during the COVID experience of what happens when neighbors have maybe particular angst against another neighbor. And so now they report them as, you know, going against the regulation. And then what is to stop? What is to stop now a individual who has a particular angst about another person and say, oh, by the way, on their Facebook page or their tweet or their whatever online, they said X, Y, and Z. And so now this is evidence enough for you to do an investigation. Now, that person doesn't have to pay for any investigation. The government does it on their behalf. So the person who's accused, they're going to have to get their own legal counsel at their own expense and fight against a government that is so well armed with lawyers and all kinds of bureaucrats to push this. And it's like, how is this even reasonable? And is there really such a problem online that this would even be necessary? And you know, when you have a government that's intent on pushing its own narrative of what it considers hate, we're going down a very dangerous road. It seems to me. It's kind of like it reminds me of, you know, John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost. Parliament at that time was going through another advance in technology called the printing press, where, you know, newspapers were proliferating and all the rest. And then the government decides it's going to establish a censorship bureau, and they're now going to decide whether or not a particular book can be published. And John Milton said that to prevent a book from being published is in essence to go against the very image of God, in the sense that the person is expressing their soul in this book, and now you're going to prevent it from being published? Well, in the same sense, if we're now going to control speech, we're going to be controlling what a person thinks and their ability to be able to speak what's on their heart and what's on their soul. You may find it offensive, but to go against that is in essence going back on the whole concept of the inviolability of the person, the idea that man is made in the image of God and therefore should be respected, and their speech should be respected. Now, how do you defeat that? Well, we've got the marketplace of ideas. We've got the idea that you're able to reasonably engage. And it seems like as time goes on, in these moments of crisis, as it was at the time of John Milton, we don't want to have any debates. We just simply want to use the strong arm of the state to enforce what is the accepted narrative. And that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, tyranny, history has taught us that authoritarian state control and the encroachments that you're describing are a whole lot more harmful than online harms, a phrase I can't really use with a straight face. So what is that? But I want to bring it back to the theological perspective here, because you did that when you bring up Milton, and I was thinking about what motivates me to have conversations about religious liberty, particularly, but really all the freedoms, is that it is a reflection of God's character, that God does not force, and that we witness to the people in our communities, in our nations, when we are there to get their back and argue in their defense and call for justice. And, you mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses and Mennonites and different religious groups who've been pressured by the military or the medical industrial complex, whatever it is, where somebody's individual conscience is coming in conflict with the state. So I know that your foundation is a lot of what you are doing is really helping to defend the freedoms of individuals. Do you have any, I don't know, any success stories, any things where people really were defended by the action that you're able to take, so people can get a glimpse into the religious liberty ministry really is what this is, to witness to
Yeah.
God's character?
Well, one of the things that I did that uh, I was very happy to say had some measure of success. During the whole COVID experience, we had a number of students who literally drove, hour plus 2 hours, whatever, to come to my home in the country, where they wanted help to put together their religious freedom exemption applications at their university. Unfortunately, many of these young people were Christians. They attended Christian churches, but their pastors themselves refused to help them because they said they needed to take the vaccine and just basically continue on in their schooling. And they refused. And so they needed help. And so they came, they contacted me. They came, I had about 6 to 8 of them, I think, at one time, show up at my door. And we worked on that. And out of the 8, I think there was about 3 of them that ultimately got their exemption. And it wasn't very easy because let me tell you, the universities, while they claimed to be giving exemptions, they were not successful. They did not do it by and large. Throughout the experience of the COVID experience here in Canada, very, very few. In fact, we have not had a case yet, unlike the United States, where there was a very robust freedom of speech, a robust questioning of the church lockdowns and all that kind of stuff. In Canada, there has been no success in the courts. The courts have been pretty much on the government side all the way across, which I think does not show well. One of the principles in Canada is that justice must not only be seen, but or justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. And many people have struggled with that. Right now, there have been a number of people that I've helped with who were charged with violating the legislation, the regulations on the public health with respect to coming across the border, that kind of thing. And I didn't actually go to court for them, but I ended up coaching them along, and they've been able to get those cases or those charges basically withdrawn. And yet there's other things that we've been trying to do and we want to do as time goes on. One of the things that I'm concerned about going forward right now is, if you've noticed, this world is becoming more and more militaristic. We've got lots of news coming up from the Middle East where things are changing rapidly. We got NATO right now that is calling upon Canada to not only increase its military spending, but to be ready because there is this sense that there's going to be war between NATO and Russia. And a particular shout out to Canada by NATO, because Canada has basically spent very little money on its military. I think we're less than 1%, or like it's hardly ever a whole lot. And so there is this militaristic push. And I'm wondering, okay, so what is the future going to hold if we're going to be in this constant state of war with very, it could be right now conventional war, but who's to say it's not going to move into a nuclear war, where what's going to happen to our freedoms then? What's going to happen to our freedom of speech? Winston Churchill said that the first casualty of war is truth. And he says truth is so important that it has to be guarded by a bodyguard of lies. And, as only Churchill could say it. But where are we going now? And this is one of the concerns I have as an organization as we look now to the future. Okay, so what does it mean to be becoming more and more militaristic as time moves on, and as governments now got all the apparatus to be able to enforce opinions and to be able to force people to do things that they would not ordinarily do, because now government, as we saw in Canada during the Emergencies Act, the invocation of the act, they froze bank accounts. I have friends who've shared with me how their wives were out in the grocery store ready to check out, and their card was not accepted. Why? Because their husband, and in one case it was an ex-husband, who was involved in being up in Ottawa, and the government said, okay, everyone related to this person, their bank accounts are frozen. Like, I mean, that is quite something. And of course, we all know that if you read the book of Revelation at all, it constantly, or not constantly, but there is this reference that you'll neither buy nor sell. Well, we saw that firsthand here in Canada as what that looks like. And it's not a very good picture. And at any given moment, we just simply don't know that if we say something that is somehow somebody finds offensive, or you don't want to be involved, or the banks don't want to be involved with you because of an opinion that you spoke, then suddenly they cut you off. I mean, it's a horrendous experience.
Yeah, that was a crossing of the Rubicon moment as far as the march of tyranny in the West in the modern age. I could not believe what I was seeing when I saw that, the freezing of the bank accounts of the truckers. And I think that's been underestimated in terms of its significance, not only prophetically, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
but even just commentators on civil liberties in general. And when you bring up the militarism, I find that to be a very pertinent current question. This isn't some distant future. I mean, this is happening now. Like literally, the past couple of weeks, you saw the announcement in Politico where you had the West saying, "Well, we may green light Ukraine to go ahead and use Western supplied munitions to engage in interior missile attacks on Russia, which
Right.
would be a major escalation in the war." And then Russia, and by the way, we're revamping our nuclear doctrine, and they came out just 4 or 5 days ago and announced that they reserve the right to use their nukes now, not just when they're hit with a nuclear attack or when they're existentially threatened, as their existence is threatened, but they said if munitions are used in the way that you just described, we reserve the right to use nuclear weaponry. So, yeah, freedoms are under assault during times of war. Even in
Mhm.
America, with our First Amendment, we had the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War One.
Right.
And there have been many occasions where dissenters, protesters, non combatants, people of religious groups that are not cooperative with militarism, they end up persecuted. So we are really glad you are there. And I hope many other religious liberty attorneys are sitting up and taking notice that we could end up with military drafts in no time here. Are we
Right.
ready to go to bat for people who are saying I believe in non-combatancy and observance of the seventh day Sabbath in the case of, you mentioned, Seventh day Adventists? I think that's important. So, you know what, Barry, as we close, just closing thoughts, and then tell our listeners how they can be a part of what you're doing, how they can help out with First Freedom Foundation, how to get in touch with you.
Sure. And by the way, I just want to piggyback on what you just said there. One of the things that I've noticed, and a good friend of mine who's done a lot of these cases over the last couple of years representing people in court, found that very few lawyers would even bother communicating or talking with potential clients because it was seen as not good for their legal career. Now, can you imagine if it's now another experience? such as a war and there's a draft, and you got people who conscientiously decide, for example, that they're not going to bear arms. Will lawyers say, well, no, we're not going to represent them because it's an unpopular opinion, an unpopular position? Um, you know, is that the kind of thing we're going to be expecting of our legal community, or do we want to ensure that we have justice for everyone, even if it is an unpopular position to have on conscience? So, anyhow, I just want to thank you so much for being here. You can find us at firstfreedoms.ca. Firstfreedoms.ca. I'm on Twitter as well at Barry W. Bussey, and we have a Facebook page and that kind of thing. But firstfreedoms.ca is where you can find us, and then I'm often speaking on issues as they come up on my Twitter account at Barry W. Bussey.
Awesome. Barry, thank you for being here. And thank you to all of you in the audience. I appreciate you guys tuning in. I'm Scott Ritzema with Belt of Truth Ministries. Of course, next week we will have another Belt of Truth live. It'll be October 9th at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time as usual. And thanks to our producer, Christian Digital Network. Great job at the back end there, Jeremy. From likes to lives changed. Scan that QR code, subscribe to CD